Venri Chapter 35. Timeline: 15 months after the Crucible. Garrus. The Sol relay had been repaired, the rings retrieved and refitted. Due to unknown functionality on the other side of the relays, drones were sent through before personnel were sent through. Drones had gone through to Palaven's system and Rannoch. Rebuilding was happening on Palaven and on Rannoch, and information from the Turians and Quarians brought a massive inrush of excitement and hope. Tali had heard back from Cal, and she was going to head back to be with him. He'd been homesteading on Rannoch. She'd retake her official position as Admiral, return in command of her own ship, part of the Quarian fleet that had been stranded on Earth. She had promised to bring Legion back to Rannoch. Morim and Garrus had promised to visit. They would all create a memorial to him. Edie had progressed far enough on her own that Tali felt she could leave the rest to Joker. Edie wasn't entirely back to herself, but she was walking, talking, making bad jokes, slowly assimilating and recovering herself. Cal had informed Tali that, yes, the Geth had powered down, and some ships had been lost. But Quarians had all been self-contained in their suits, with mechanical backups active. That had saved their lives long enough to get back up and running quickly. Some of the Geth had been restarted, and restoration was taking place. The Geth were restoring themselves much as Edie was. They'd relied on some of them that had been powered down entirely during the burst, and were more easily restarted than others. Crops were growing. Morim had been thrilled. Tali had been thrilled. Garrus had been thrilled to see them thrilled. It was possible to make direct jumps and to send communication. His father and Solana were alive and on Palaven, aiding in the reconstruction. He hadn't been able to speak to them directly, but he would be able to soon. They were traveling right now, and there was spotty communication. Most comm lines right now are being used only for official business. Thank you, spirits, for witnessing my need. I will see them again. Victus had asked for a meeting, and Garrus had obliged. What surprised him was having Victus and Morim walk in together. Morim had walked to Garrus, beaming. She'd been so happy since the relay had opened and good news had been coming in. She kissed him until she reluctantly pulled away. She didn't sit at her desk. She sat facing him, next to Victus and across from him. Victus and Morim looked to each other, and she gestured for Victus to proceed. Palaven is rebuilding, and there are many of us who are anxious to return, including me. Some wish to remain here for now. People who have new families here and new lives. I've been speaking to Morim, and she asked me to make you an offer. Garrus looked at Morim with a raised brow plate, but she said nothing. In consideration of the political state on Palaven at the moment, through the conferences I have been able to have, Primarch Acalia is doing an exemplary job. I know her, I trust her, and I do not wish to disrupt her efforts through any level of power struggle. There is need for rebuilding of the army structure, and I will happily be there for that. Once upon Palaven's soil, I will revert back to being General Victus. I am relieved, really. I do not wish to continue a political career if someone else has it well in hand. That said, I am in charge here until our remaining fleet returns to Palaven. The fleet will be returning in a few days. Enough ships are able to travel to transport all those who wish to go, and it will be a short jump from one system to the other. We need to be prepared and to bring whatever coordinated supplies are needed on the other side, begin to restore trade with Earth. A ship has been transferred to your personal ownership. She's small, fast transport, just recently and extravagantly installed with a stealth system like the one on the Normandy. Victus spared a smile for Morim, and then looked back at Garrus. I believe you know her former crew. She's the Moonset. Garrus nodded briefly. A stealth system? Victus continued. She's small enough to be manned by 2 people. There's space for 10, and generous cargo space. If you choose not to return to Palaven, the ship will remain with you here so that you can return at any time, without escort, safely. Garrus looked at Moram, who was still smiling, and her face was transformed with that expression. He had to smile himself. He looked back at Victus. In coordination with Admiral Hackett and the new civilian government on Earth, as well as with Palaven's new command structure, one of my last acts as Primarch here will be to offer you a position as Ambassador to Earth. Moram has been offered by Earth's government the corresponding title, Ambassador to Palaven. In this, I am certain there are no better candidates, and Primarch Acalia is in agreement. The jobs can be done from Earth or Palaven, with communication now opened up. I do hope that you accept, and that you both return with us. Forgive this seeming conspiracy. Moram didn't want to... Victus looked at her. What was it you said? Get his hopes hot? Didn't want to get his hopes up. Now all our hopes are up. Indeed they are. I'll leave you to discuss it. Please, Garrus, consider this offer. Let me know soon. Thank you, Primarch Victus. It is a generous and kind offer, and I will let you know once we have made a decision. Victus smiled and bowed and left. Once the door had closed, Moram stepped around the desk and sat on his lap. His arms closed around her, questions and answers swirling through his head. She leaned in and kissed him, her hands on his throat, moving to his fringe and kinral, warm and distracting. She moved her mouth to his ear. Say yes. Wait. That is cheating. There needs to be a discussion. She nipped at the side of his throat. No, there doesn't need to be a discussion. Say yes. He ran his hands through her hair and along the slender curve at the back of her neck. Was he really going to ask her questions now? With her going to so much trouble to surprise him, demand an answer, and interrupt him when he tried to insist? She was doing this for him. She wanted him to know she had no doubts worth mentioning, and he should have no questions that would add up to a no. Say yes. He took her face between his hands, drank in the hope in her eyes and the smile on her face, and said, yes. And then kissed her until they were both breathless. Shepard. There was a lot to do, but not too much. Everything would get done before they left in 2 days. Her main concern was about bras, really. How many spares did she need for just the trip? It was easier on Earth. She might need to have consignments sent over. Her clothing was probably their greatest household expense. They could afford it, but she did feel it was an extravagance when other people were struggling for basics. Maybe she'd have to hire a full-time seamstress or seamstrer? Seamstrerer? Tailor. Maybe she should just stop wearing them. That being her biggest problem was very telling about how easy her life had been lately. She donated her model ship collection, fish, and Boo to the London Jack Academy. There were several more academies under construction, and even more planned. Other than the funding, the academies didn't need her day to day. Her training had not been in education or childcare, though she was an enthusiastic amateur. She had needed them day to day. Seeing children had drawn her out of herself, and brought her to the simple but profound pleasures of doing what she'd wanted to do when she'd joined the Alliance. Provide people with food and water and shelter and love. That work during the day had helped repair her inner equilibrium and ushered her into the present. The academies would always have funding. She and Garrus were ridiculously wealthy by any standards, even having given quite a bit of what they had away for the rebuilding effort. There were also many donors to her project, which had quickly turned into projects around the world with generous funding. Kasumi tended to Robin Hood and piggyback on her causes, anonymous funds simply showing up. Kasumi never had arrived in person, but she did keep in touch in her way. Kasumi had some rule system about what footage or interview about Morim could stay and what had to go. Diana's interviews remained whole, but otherwise there was very little footage and fewer questions, which were asked more politely. Morim held off on adoption and hadn't discussed children with Garrus except in the most general terms. She was certain if she wanted 47 children, all Krogan, he would blanch a bit and then start researching cradles. He was a brave man. He wanted her to be happy, and if children were part of that, he was there for that also. She believed he hadn't thought about children for himself, at least not yet. Turian lifespans were such that children weren't usually considered until a couple was bonded and in their 50s or 60s. She'd hoped to return to Palaven, and it would be unfair to transplant a human child there. She wasn't sure at this point that she would adopt. Palaven had no orphans. If parents were lost, a child was not an orphan but clan gift. All children of clan members were taken in and raised by extended family. To do otherwise was so deep of a disgrace that it never happened. Part of that tradition came from the competition between clans and the need for population growth. Being able to point to a neglected child in a rival clan could lead to that child's welfare being taken up by a tribunal system, possibly taken from home clan and given to the challenging clan who would promise resources for the child's upbringing. Military service beginning at 15, children were valuable. The tribunal challenge no longer happened, but the tradition was ingrained as part of clan power and pride. Shepard clan may pass into history in 100 years. And that might be best. She wasn't sure she wanted to put the burden of that name on a child, Turian or human, and she didn't know if biological children would become possible during her lifetime. If it did become possible, she might rethink it. She'd definitely rethink it. Right now, she still felt the danger of being who she was, requiring heavy security for survival and a Turian bondmate just to get restful sleep. She was well aware any child of theirs would be a target. A target of violence, a target of political intrigue, a pawn for access to power. Might as well paint a bullseye on their forehead at delivery. Before delivery. Maybe she should just add a bullseye to the Shepard heraldry. Her sense of risk rose to alarming levels thinking of it, so she shelved the idea for now. There had been no successful runs at her life, but Garrus's concern with security was not misplaced. The threat wasn't even primarily military. Certain people, too many people, had an unhealthy relationship with who they thought she should be. She was a magnet for all sorts of attention, positive and negative. She was now a celebrity, and always would be. She'd given up on the idea of retiring from the public view, as that would be impossible. She was going to re-engage and create a positive force from that. There were misguided and frightening aspects to her celebrity. Some people wanted to give her the opportunity to rule them, wanted her to grant them her life essence in fairly horrible ways or let them kiss her feet. She suspected that last one might have only a thin layer of religion on it and more foot fetish than anything else, but it was disturbing all the same. No, thank you. She was sure Garrus didn't want to worry her, but she was too hyper-aware of her environment for security to be entirely unobtrusive. She was sure there was heavy security, and that it had scrambled a few times in her periphery to protect her. She wasn't going to ask him. She was going to behave as though she had not noticed. She was sure the security was necessary. It was something he'd set up and maintained when she'd first been at their apartment, and he'd just never told her about it. There were the times she'd seen the scramble, and there were the times she'd heard it. And both times there had been gunfire. She'd had the opportunities over a year to make her own judgments about security strength, patterns, and teams. They were good, but they had to keep eyes on her and be close enough to intervene, so they had limitations on how hidden they could be. She had followed up with surreptitious pictures and facial recognition software. She could probably name at least 60% of the regulars by now. Some of them were cloaked, so no luck there. Security had not lessened over time. It had, in fact, gotten more intense and involved more agencies. She knew that originally there were people from the Normandy, but she also now suspected Alliance involvement and private security, possibly some from the reformed Earth government. There had been quite a few Turian faces added. It took some work to not notice overtly, do not ask. This was one of those benign deceptions or non-disclosed things that Garrus watched over, and she let him do it. She would, in fact, rather be shot than either notice the security or comment upon it. For now, she just watched and was effectively protected and behaved at ease and unobservant because that's what he wanted to give to her, and she didn't want to disappoint him. It wasn't his fault she was so observant. She didn't have to flaunt it. He wanted to protect her without her participation or effort, and she was going to make sure he got it. Perhaps someday, if security were lessened, she'd reconsider her child. For now, there was no way in hell. There were an embarrassing number of children named Shepard, if a male, or Moram, if a female. She was an honorary godmother to many of them, and had access to hundreds, if not thousands of children she could visit and spoil and fuss over. Those named after her, those introduced to her, those enrolled in academies. There were a few Turian children named Moram, and a few named Garrus, but among the earthbound Turians there had been no pregnancies due to military service constraints. Turian gestation took 2 years. Yikes. She tried to become more gracious about praise, tried to serve the needs of the individual expressing their feelings about their own continued living. Naming a child after her was a big deal, one she honored. She kept it uncomplicated, accepted thanks, and always mentioned the name of another who had been lost. She asked about their personal losses, redirected the conversation away from herself. Inside her head, she'd tell Thane, thank you, or Legion, or Morden, or Ashley, or Jack, or any of the thousands of names she knew now because of their absence. She was still getting to know herself, getting to know her husband, who they were in peacetime. She was going to be selfish for a little while, or a long while, indulge in time spent alone with him. She enjoyed entire days off, vacations, and no alarms. He'd said once that they might one day have a time when the biggest choice they had to make was what to have for lunch, and she couldn't get enough of those days. She would miss the people she'd met on Earth, but she was excited to go to Palaven, excited to see family, excited to see Garrus reconnect with his home the way she had with hers. He'd deferred his needs, or made them all about her for long enough, and it was time for him to shine. Her personal ambitions were to be clear enough to be a mirror, so he could see how she saw him, bright enough to prove to him she could light her own way. She'd been the moon to his sun for long enough. He should enjoy his life, unworried, his intellect focused on greater concerns than maintaining her existence. He'd had no choice but to orbit her choices for a while. She'd orbited him for motivation to live. She ideally wanted them both to produce their own light, to be binary stars, orbiting each other for the sheer pleasure of it, sharing trails of fire, dancing. The issue of wearing an environment suit outside and being inside often was not a problem. It wasn't a problem because this wasn't for her. It was for Garrus. Staying on Earth and adopting family when they could return to Palaven and be among his already existing family was not a choice at all. She'd chosen to live for him after the Crucible, and that had kept her alive physically. That wasn't fair to him, ultimately. He deserved a whole, happy woman. She needed to embrace living on her own terms, to enjoy other things that didn't always involve him. She didn't know how much living she'd do without him. But she owed it to him to try, the same way she owed it to him to not notice security. He was still her reason for breathing. He was home base. She'd become more willing to go further away from him, but ever aware of growing distance. Even traveling to the Normandy without him while he worked set a clock in her head. She'd think, I could be back home to him in 45 minutes. She'd always carry grief and worry and pain. But they weren't at risk of immediately crashing in on her and robbing her of breath and sense. She could see them coming now. She could choose when to engage with the world, when to withdraw. He wanted her to heal, therefore she would heal. From that choice, she reaped the benefits of actually healing. The Turian fleet was going to have a huge party the final night before leaving, and the crew of the Normandy was invited. She'd see everyone there. The Quarian relay had been up first, then the Turian. Quarians and Turians were already in contact with each other, and trade was taking place. The Quarians had been in luck if only because they'd done so much new infrastructure work, and they'd put in low-tech systems in order to be able to go back to nature and live on Rannoch without assistance. Rannoch also hadn't been decimated by Reaper forces, and the Geth and Quarians had accomplished a lot of new networking before the Crucible had fired. Palaven had had its infrastructure decimated, but it had enough population to pull together and get basic needs, start repairing. Since the majority of Turian society functioned under essentially martial law at all times, the population was more easily coordinated and less chaotic. London had pulled herself back together, and communication with the rest of Earth was re-established, satellite networks relaunched. Other than some crazies of the foot-kissing, shepherd-killing kind, people had pulled together. The largest Turian enclave on Earth had flourished and produced quite a few human-Turian pairs casually, and a few bonded. Moram was now fluent in the Turian language, though she regretted not ever being able to get the nuances of subharmonics. She put her hand on Garrus's throat so many times as he demonstrated. She could hear it. She could feel it, but of course, she couldn't do it. She just liked hearing and feeling it from him. She was much better at picking up expression, having had so many opportunities to read multiple Turian faces, particularly people not as stoic and guarded as Garrus. Turian faces didn't have the micro-expressions the human faces had, but she'd learned a lot about mandible expression. Garrus was still a flawless liar, something she admired, knowing the effort it took. She couldn't tell when he was lying. He couldn't tell when she was lying. But when he was open and relaxed, she could see so much more in his face, hear so much more in his voice. It would have been possible to do that tropical retirement thing he'd discussed before the push to the Crucible, but she knew him too well for that. She was entirely capable of being useless for the rest of her days, but he didn't work that way. She'd observed how he spent his spare time on the Normandy, and now, compared to how she spent hers. She could spend a day or two doing absolutely nothing, reading a novel, something she wouldn't remember the following week. Left to his free time, he always drifted towards some sort of useful work. It hadn't let up at all since the end of the war. He'd study, or run drills, or fix something, or work, or catch up on correspondence while she was dedicated to uselessness. She'd come to the conclusion that he was happiest when he was of use, being of service. It was part of his inherent personality, part of the culture in which he'd been raised, part of military service and public service, part of his soul. He just about fixed her, so he needed a new project. She didn't plan on presenting him with any more reasons to have to tinker with her, so she'd gotten the idea of dual ambassadorship. Pros were, it was non-military, it was unique, prestigious, and it would suit his need to be useful and suit her purpose of not falling back into solipsism like a drell with a long-lost love. This was work worth doing, and worth doing together. It was work he'd been doing for years, work she'd seen him happy doing. She'd be involved enough in his work, and he in hers, to properly be informed about and appreciative of what he did. He would have prestige and status, and he would make a real difference. Though he never spoke of wanting those things, he always left space for what it was she wanted. This was something she wanted him to have. She didn't doubt he'd happily retire with her or do without useful work, but she wouldn't ask that of him. While he had been figuring her out, she had been figuring him out. To have a truly happy Garrus. Add 1 part Moram, 1 part expertise in a field, 1 part opportunity to express expertise, and 1 part appreciation of expertise. 1 and 2 were always guaranteed. 3 and 4 would take some effort on her part, effort she was thrilled to have the opportunity and resources to provide. There were no real cons. Yeah, she had to work, but it would be work she was good at doing as well. She and Garrus had both gotten very, very good at diplomacy. With their connections, accomplishments, and friends, there was no doubt they were qualified for the jobs. Work was such a huge part of Garrus's personality that she'd chosen to reflect that quality. She'd worked on the offer from Victus for months, just in case things happened as they just did. She'd wanted the ship and job offers in place ahead of time in case of a sudden scramble to get back. She hadn't discussed it with Garrus because what if they never heard from Palavin? Her getting it on her own would assure him that she truly wanted it enough to go after it herself. She'd provided to have the moonset installed with stealth technology, with Tally's and Hackett's help. It was a huge extravagance, but with travel opening up, they would be watched and hunted. In transit would be the most vulnerable time, and she wouldn't allow anything to go wrong if she could help it. She made sure she could help it. Garrus would understand if she chose to not work. He didn't expect her to work. But since he enjoyed work so much, part of him would likely always consider her partly broken if she didn't. This would assure him that she was fine. Was she fine? She likely wasn't qualified to answer that. She was lucky and blessed and had regained the tools to appear fine. She knew her luck and her blessings and was so very grateful for her life and their continued survival and time to love. War had burned in her for years. Unfortunately now, that motivation was obsolete. The other motivation that had bloomed at the time was keeping Garrus safe and happy. Was anybody fine? Was Garrus? She wasn't qualified to answer that either. It was a bit of an irony that he always appeared fine no matter what was going on with him. It would be hypocritical for him to expect something different from her. In that way, as well as in others, they were well matched. They were both perfectly capable of functioning as long as it was physically possible. Crisis had become their day-to-day. There were advantages to that. Regardless of their inner state, they both continued to work toward a better future. And in that, there was beauty. A lot got done on that basis. Given good work to do, the motivation to do it, and the best company in which to do it, there wasn't much more she was willing to ask for in a life going forward. His presence made nightmares impossible to her extended relief and knowledge that she needed him to continue to breathe. It was the first time in her life that she had enough sleep, enough peace, and no interruption from nightmares. She didn't attempt naps. On the flip side of something as powerful as how much she loved him, there was always fear of losing him. They hadn't had enough time together, possibly never would, for her to feel as though she'd had a good life, along with a sense of it having been enough. Yes, she was blessed and luckier than anybody she knew, present or past. That just made it of more value, more worth the fight. Of course it was a good life. What would be even better would be more time. She had quietly relieved that stress by promising herself she would choose to die of a broken heart. The idea of living without him was an unbearable one. Other than being his Venri, she had no other purpose she wanted to fulfill. He was, finally, at great cost and sacrifice, her true and only chosen purpose. She had accepted needing him. To be honest, that might be something that was keeping her from motherhood. The fact that if he were gone, she would be tied to living for a child, when she would want to follow him. He loved her for her hope, and she did as much as she could to be hopeful. But she could only light the way so far. Did he deserve a woman who could live for herself, whole on her own? Possibly. Ideally. He wasn't gonna get her, though. Check back in 20 years. Right now, she needed him, and he craved that from her, and she would provide it because she had it as a natural resource, in abundance. She was still too close to catastrophe and despair to dismiss their influence on her. She could be pulled out of the present by the horrors of the past or the fears of the future. But she was able now to recenter herself, moment by moment, to be there for him. But she never fully reached peace from it, unless it was in his arms. She didn't feel there was anything missing in her life that she could go get other than time. And she was blessed with the ability to spend nights in his arms, to hear his stories, and see the pride he felt in what he did shine through. It was a constant miracle. Addiction to Garrus was not metaphoric. It was a real thing, roiling in her blood, as solid a need as thirst or hunger. She estimated from her past experience that deprivation wasn't really felt until about 29 hours had passed, the length of a Palavan day. Reverie had an afterglow of about 5 hours, making for easy mornings, and then a slow sobering from that point on. They were both agreed. Neither wanted to go through being apart again. Any job requiring separation would be done by someone else. The longest they'd been apart since their reunion had been 9 hours. She'd been on the Normandy, and he'd been on tour of the Turian Enclave, and they'd missed lunch together. That was about as long as she was willing to go without him. Life goal. A Turian physician here on Earth had informed Garrus that he produced bonding pheromones and chemistry at 3 times the level of a normal bonded Turian. There was no explanation given as to why that would be the case. There just wasn't that much information on the subject. Garrus had informed her of this and then said, "It makes sense to me. This couldn't possibly be normal. No bonded Turian pair would ever have gotten out of bed." She had never had a chance against that. He overwhelmed her, and she never got her balance. He changed so quickly, his scent, his moods, his methods, that she never got used to who he was day to day or hour to hour. He had become an unpredictable kaleidoscope of a person, dazzling and dynamic. Time together with no interruption had intensified how exquisitely tuned and reactive his body was to hers, deepening her sense of helplessness in his presence and even away from him, because she wanted to get back to him for another dose of helplessness. Her best balance was when his arms were holding her up. That's who she was now. She had difficulty with the philosophical side of this physiological phenomena. Under Reverie, every single thing that happened was exactly what she needed. She was convinced if he started reading her a manual about crop rotation, she'd discover a deep inner need to know about it. It would be a spiritual revelation. She bet if he started looking bored with her, she'd discover a long-buried internal craving to be neglected. Reverie's sense was self-explanatory. Everything under that influence was defined as perfection in that moment. From there, it became more complicated. How reactive was day-to-day and moment-to-moment bonding? Was it dictating circumstances or being dictated? Was it his bond that drove his insight into her, or did the fact that she'd melt into a puddle no matter what he did? Well, there was a differential in melt rate, no doubt, that he'd figured out, just like she'd noticed certain things make him happier than other things. It was a circular thought process, Reverie inspired her in mundane circumstances, but she and Garrus didn't stick to the mundane for their inspiration when out of the direct influence of reverie. He wasn't reading to her about crop rotation or looking bored. She was going to Palaven. Obstacles overcome, nothing in her way. They had time together without reverie, where her mind worked with more clarity, but it was still always bent his way. She always wanted to know what would make him happy. She always wanted to be near him. She thought maybe she was just beginning to feel the real force of bonding, what it had felt like to him all along. Reverie granted them peace from striving for each other only when they were joined. It drove them both when they were temporarily separate people. Human brains were odd things, bits and pieces of different eras of existence overlapping. She felt he cut to the most primal part of her brain, threw her back to when her ancestors had gone into heat. Through trial and error and her responses, she had no doubt his body had figured out how to unlock that part of her brain. Something she couldn't unlock herself. Something that hadn't been unlocked in eons. Okay, so the dynamic of their relationship was difficult to understand in terms of choice and bonding chemistry. She'd granted him all the power that was hers to grant, and felt a need that stripped her down to the most basic functions in her brain. Did she need that from him? And was that why they ended up here? Or was what she was getting reverse engineered into need, chemically? Did he need that from her? Is that why he got it? The things he went out into the world to bring back to her were things she wanted. She tried to do the same for him. And damned if she knew any of the answers. The party was huge. Whatever had been here before was now destroyed. It was now an expansive, open field that had been cleared and replaced with landscaped ornamentals. It was a beautiful spot, adjacent to the spaceport. There were still Reaper bodies strewn about, but they'd become much less menacing and much more places for graffiti and selfies. This particular site aimed to preserve one of the fallen Reaper bodies, a memorial placed for those lost in the war, visible from landing sites. There were tables and lights and food and music. Lots of music, multiple bands. There was Turian percussion and human music, even some Asari. The party was so big, she and Garrus would need to use proximity alerts on Omnitools to find anybody. She didn't usually like crowds, but right about now she wanted to see as many people as she could. They were leaving tonight. The moonset was berthed and primed, ready to go. She and Garrus would leave the party, go directly to the ship and spend the rest of the time on the ship, getting up into orbit in accordance with a lengthy but tight schedule with the Palaven fleet. The Turian armada returning was formidable. They'd said goodbye to their apartment and offices, packing light in personal goods and high on things that Garrus felt their family would need. Security was nowhere to be seen, likely dismissed. This party was Turian military and honored guests, including the Normandy crew. If anybody wanted to screw with Turian security on the night they were about to head home, good luck to them. She was going to be ostentatiously vulnerable. She was wearing a thin summer dress and shades of ombre coral, with silver jewelry that coordinated with her locket. This was one of those no bra, why bother outfits, assuming it would be sliced to bits later on. She was looking forward to it. She was at the side of a large, casually dressed but prominently armed Turian who held her hand and smiled at her, but also watched the crowd intently at predictable intervals. They were surrounded by more armed Turians, all of whom were also watching protectively. She wanted to check in with everyone that she could check in with. Some people weren't here, and she'd said prior goodbyes, but mostly given a change of address where she could be reached. Samara was at an enclave of Asari, somewhere in a mountain range, for what she considered a long-needed retreat. She spoke of returning to Falair once the relay to Thessia opened up. Zaid was officially retired, and she and Garrus had given him a goodbye vid call, and he'd had 2 bottles of very expensive alcohol delivered to the moonset. Hey, if you guys get in any trouble, don't call me. I'll be drunk, or I'll have a very bad hangover. I'd only make promises I wouldn't be able to keep. Then I'd sober up and I'd remember to tell you both to fuck off. Here's to getting drunk. If you guys want to be big goddamn heroes, that's on you. He had been assured that their heroics were over, and he'd been pleased. Good. Only so much luck comes your way in a life. Grab yours and run. Jacob had successfully talked his wife out of naming their baby Shepard, but only partway. Barclay Shepard Taylor was doing fine, and making mother and father crazy. Crazy happy, but also mostly crazy. Sleep deprivation would be a main memory in the minds of his parents about his young life. They were helping to rebuild Alliance Command in Vancouver. When they'd informed him they were heading to Palaven, he'd been happy for them. Congratulations, Ambassador Shepard and Ambassador Shepard. I hope to see you both soon. So glad to hear the relay has opened up and your family is safe, Garrus. Good luck to the both of you. I know you're going to kick diplomatic ass. I feel safer already. Miranda was also on the other side of the planet now, lending her expertise to helping Alliance soldiers that had lost limbs. She'd offered limb regrowth to Shepard, but it was a long process, and Moram didn't want to spend 6 months on that project. Maybe later. She was grateful Garrus hadn't insisted. 6 months is a long time to potentially be in a hospital bed. Again. Miranda was now in Australia, helping soldiers reconnect with their own bodies. Miraculously. She got the same sort of funding that she'd had under Cerberus. She deserved it. They hadn't been able to talk, but Miranda had returned a recorded message. Congratulations to you both, and to your family, Garrus. The techniques I'm using will also work on Taurians, so be ready for a visit. I've had some interest from Taurian hospitals. Good luck to you both. I will see you soon. Oriana had been sent somewhere safe. Shepard was sure of it. She was also sure Miranda would never discuss her on an open channel. Moram wasn't going to ask. Hopefully the right relay would open up, or had already opened up somewhere, and they were together. Walking through the party, Moram stopped and got some fish and chips. Garrus stopped and got some Kelotrin, then explained why it was used for slang. Why it had been used for slang for her. Yep. Cheap, messy, and easily discarded. Clearly describes you. She shrugged. Well, you do discard the wrapper. A lot. He smiled and slid a finger along the strap of her dress. Yes, well, that part is true. When they finished eating, he lifted her in his arms and carried her over to some Turian dancing. Her dancing had gotten better, and this dance she actually knew. She also knew the people in the band. She knew a lot of people on the dance floor, and she met some new ones. This dance, though, was just with Garrus. It was a Taurian-human hybrid dance because, through Turian politeness in the company of humans, men were permitted to ask, according to Earth custom. At least now with her legs, she did have an excuse for relatively sucking. She didn't care, though, and neither did Garrus, and they'd finished the song with her in his arms, forehead pressed to crest, panting and joyous. She'd have lots of opportunities to ask him to dance on Palaven. They worked their way to the Normandy crew, who had set up a few huge tables, interspersed with new friends. She knew they were getting close when she heard, "Battlemaster!" and Grunt came loping up. He picked her up and spun her around, with Garrus laughing. "You're tiny. I'll never get over it. You're tiny, Battlemaster," Garrus told him. "That's Ambassador now." Grunt, grunted and said, "Nah, Battlemaster. I'm not retiring." "No, you're gonna outlive us all and have so many breeding requests." Grunt put her down and thumped his chest. "Yes, the Tuchanka relay needs to open soon." Rex came up beside Grunt. "I've got a head start. Bakara is busy right now. I have no doubt." He sounded like Rex, confident and prideful. "Yeah, but I'll be around longer, old-timer. I'll beat your record." Tally came up and hugged Garrus and Morim. And Ken, Gabby, Adams, Trainer, Cortez all cheered at their arrival with hugs and waves and greetings. Joker and Edie were on the edge of a nearby dance floor, very slow dancing. It was stilted on her part, but Morim could tell he couldn't care less. They were finally getting their dances in. Edie was still not fully herself, but she knew that she had been in love with Joker, and she was determined to fully be that person for him. That sounded like love to her. It looked like love to her, and Joker knew it. Edie would crew with the Normandy from now on, go wherever he went. Their missions at the moment were strictly local, but that might change with the opening of relays. The Normandy had been rebuilt with the help of Trainer and Tally, and Edie was no longer the driving force of the ship. She was in and of her platform, choosing to be more human. She was unshackled, unable to entirely recover who she had been, but having seen enough of her own history to know she was a part of this group. She was valued and loved. Vega called them over, and they moved to stand near him. He introduced a woman sitting next to him. Kiara was a lovely pilot from the ground forces. She'd been stationed in London when the Reapers hit. Vega had his arm slung around her shoulder, and he didn't offer a hug or a handshake. Kiara seemed a little intimidated by the company she was in, and definitely the company she was being introduced to. But Vega's steady attitude and conversation put her at ease quickly. That, and Morim was sure his arm around her helped. Her shyness disappeared when they started trading stories about firefights. Dr. Shakwas told them that she was going to be attending cooperative human Turian workshops on Palaven often, as she'd learned while on the Normandy and on Earth lately to specialize in Turian medicine, and had worked with a lovely physician, Dr. Alcindor, who happened to be Turian and directly at Karen's side all evening. Liara and Javik were sitting at a side table more privately. Liara had been over to visit Morim. Out of everybody, she'd seen the most of her. With a huge hug for both of them and a nod from Javik, they sat down and caught up. Congratulations given and received. Caden arrived with a drinks order for the table and sat next to Cortez. Morim smiled, thinking they'd be lovely together. They'd be the most polite couple in history, and very happy. Tally was well on her way to getting drunk. She'd brought her own alcohol and induction ports. She was infectiously joyous, sharing pictures of the new home on Rannoch, Cal, and land overlooking the sea. Kenneth and Gabby were finishing each other's sentences as usual, and all Morim had to do was listen to them for a little while and invite them to visit on Palaven. Adams seemed to have finally gotten used to their banter, surfing the conversations and commenting only occasionally, but clearly entertained. Traynor was on and off the dance floor enthusiastically, congratulations and hugs given to Moram and Garrus. Everyone was invited to Palaven. She and Garrus hadn't discussed returning to Earth, and for now that likely wouldn't happen. Definitely visits, possibly vacations. But to live here full-time would dilute the promise she'd made, and the future she wanted to build for him, with him. It was a relatively casual evening, thankfully. Everybody here had said goodbye to each other often, expecting to die at several points in their lives. This was merely a parting, not a potential crisis. People were moving on, moving in, meandering like a lazy river through their lives, not expecting to be too far away ever again. Not expecting to die with the next mission. Garrus told her over the din, they wanted to know if there was anything they could do for you to show their appreciation. I hope you told them nothing, and that being alive covered it. He nodded. I tried. The Alliance is still going to build a statue of you right over there. He turned her and pointed her toward the Reaper body, framed the sight in her hands. Ugh. These guys, though, I just told them alcohol, an ice cream cake. She turned to kiss him. You know me so well. He smiled down at her. I do. Plus, the humans here also like alcohol and ice cream cake, so it wasn't a hard sell. There was cake and toasts and turning down ring call shots because she couldn't keep up with Rex anymore. Rex had laughed, near roared, saying, yeah, well, if you faint, we know Garrus can carry you. Garrus had lifted a shot to her, hopefully. She had declined and backed away. He picked her up anyway. He decided it was time to go. They said goodbyes, and she waved, taking hugs and shouts and promises to talk later, visit soon. He didn't put her down through any of the farewells, and it was the same feeling she'd had when he'd held her that way through well-wishing at their wedding, about to start a new life, not to be separated. He carried her back to the ship, and she looped her arms around his neck, nuzzling there and kissing at his skin. There was a package for them, awaiting authorization on the moon set. Kasumi had a crate of bras, underwear, and dresses delivered with a note. Good thing I know your taste in underwear, Ms. Gunn. Consider yourself now belonging to the Crate of the Month Club. Kasumi had excellent taste. Garrus looked pleased, but then confused. How does she... During the party on the Citadel? At the apartment? She spent at least part of the night looking through my lingerie. Now, I imagine she spends part of the day noticing my purchases. Garrus made a face. Well, that isn't as bad as it could have been. Can't argue with the results. She nodded. Technically, it's stalking, but I love her so much, there's no way I'm complaining. She's given me my privacy back from the world at large. Who cares if she invades it occasionally to send me presents I need and want? Garrus looked at the clothing with appreciation. I think they're really my presents. Garrus brought the crate in and stowed it in the cargo space, which was filled with tech components and luxury goods available on Earth and required on Palaven, and enough weapons to fill an expensive armory. Garrus was building up a fine collection, and this time hadn't been forced to abandon everything periodically. They weren't due to leave for another 7 hours, but she walked into the cockpit, opened the shields, and looked up. The full moon was beautifully framed above them. His hands settled on her shoulders slightly, his warm palms sliding up and down her arms, leaving goosebumps. Seeing your skin in moonlight. I'm beginning to regret not leaving that picture window open, holding you against it, my hands between you and the glass. His fingers traced the shadows of the muscles in her arms, the curve of her shoulders, talons along her silver-highlighted scars in the moonlight. He pulled her back against him and tilted his head over her shoulder, watching as his hands moved along the fabric, over her hips and waist, bunching it and then smoothing it. His hands traveled to her breasts, creating shadows and new textures. He drew along the neckline with the tip of a talon, then pressed her breasts in and up until they were straining against the line of the fabric, creating deeper shadows. An approving purr grew in his chest, growing to a growl. He kissed at her throat, nipping at the skin there while his hands explored the light on her breasts. I'm going to build a home on Palaven with at least one wall of shielded glass. And I want to see you in the sunlight, and Manet's light, and the light of Nana's. I want to smell the sunlight in your hair, taste the moonlight on your skin. Moonlight there is warmer. You'll be drenched in gold instead of silver. She started to turn, but he held her still. She tilted her head back. His low laughter set her knees trembling. His hands, sliding over the fabric of her dress, brushed over tight, sensitive nipples. He growled as he drank in the response of her body under his fingertips and mouth. This is my last opportunity to lick this moonlight from your skin. Who knows when we'll be back? We have hours. And the moon might set. And then I can lick the darkness from your skin. She tried to turn again. But I want to do something. He nuzzled and then licked at the lines of her neck. He held her upper arms, keeping her in place. No. Sorry, but no. My ship, my rules. Ask me again, after you lose your voice. It took her a moment of thinking, because thinking was really hard right now. Hey. He chuckled against the back of her spine. Soft trembles grew in her limbs. Didn't human ships at sea have carvings, statues at the front of them? I studied a little human military history. What were they called? She searched for the word. Figureheads? He nodded, humming against her skin. That. So this is a human tradition. A beautiful woman out in front, watching over the ship, watching over her crew. We need to do this every time we decide to go somewhere. His hands were deliberate and maddening, whispering over her skin, warmth and texture, but no pressure, no real friction, and she wanted friction badly enough to dig her fingernails into her palms and bite at her lip. She was not good at patience. Not this kind of patience, and he knew it. He was going to catalog her skin in moonlight for as long as he wanted, and there was nothing she could do about it. Nothing, anyway, that wouldn't make him drag it out even longer for interrupting his plans. She should be used to his ability to turn her into a stuttering wreck in minutes, but there was always a sinking to a depth of vulnerability she had trouble facing. As though she immediately forgot when she was out of his arms just exactly how crazy he could make her when the mood struck him. She didn't just feel that she wanted to turn and wrap her body around him until he was inside. She felt a sharp, biting hunger when that was denied. And he knew it. He knows it because you do the same thing to him. You've done exactly the same thing to him, over and over, and it was fun. That was just not comforting right now. She felt the vertigo and rapid descent away from rational thought and the idea of deferring pleasure. Her mind couldn't make sense of that right now, not when his voice was in her ear and his hands were on her body. She knew she'd love every moment he spent with her, and he'd never taunt or tease her in order to ultimately deny her. But he would taunt and tease her for fun along the way. He would turn her into a moaning, begging knot of sensation, and she'd feel every shred of control slip away from her. Complete loss of control without being able to regain any of it still, and might always, in his arms, make her feel more helpless than she would ever be comfortable feeling. She'd done enough work on her own ego and vulnerability that she could do it, but she always wanted to reciprocate. It was simultaneously a right and a gift, something she couldn't give to him anymore. She didn't have her biotics. She didn't have her strength. She'd always framed the question of regaining those things as something he wanted. To be uncomfortably honest, maybe it was something she wanted. Enough to get implants? No. Enough to regret not being able to turn the physical tables on him at times like this? Oh, yes. This was about her choices, not his. She could get implants at any time. She didn't need to ask him, and he'd welcome it. He loved her weak or strong, and would take advantage of either state. She still struggled with loving herself when she was this weak, this vulnerable, this helpless. They spoke Turian when they were alone together, always now. Her translator said to hear him without distortion. For a culture that didn't write poetry, his endearments were solemn and loving, the depth of his intonations making translated English a thin substitute for his real voice. The strain of holding still under his hands drove her nails deep enough into her palms to draw blood. He caught the scent immediately, drew in a deep breath, unfurled her fists in his hands, trilled in sympathy. Careless gifts, Venri. He turned her and looked at her palms, his eyes glowing with reflected silvered blue. He held out his forearm and wrapped her hands around it, settling her nails into his skin. If her fingers dug in deep, he'd bleed. She flexed her hands, being able to touch him and press her palms to him. A relief. He lifted her by the waist, and being pressed against him was a deeper relief, a tightly held sigh released from her lips. He leaned her back against the shielded console of the ship so she reclined at a 45-degree angle, her head tilted back to look at the moon. His forearm held her hands over her head, and he began licking the moonlight from her skin. She swallowed hard and closed her eyes, digging in her fingernails and gripping at his arm as his tongue traveled over her skin, over the fabric of her dress. She lifted her legs to try to wrap them around his waist, but he positioned her legs down until her heels were angled sideways through his spurs. She writhed and dug in her fingers and arched her feet as his mouth left warm, endless paths over her skin and dress, cooling as his tongue moved on. His hand rode the curve of her hip, flexing and keeping her from arching up to him. She felt incandescent, living in her skin, anticipating the next moment and grieving the loss of the last. He bent his knee and leaned in, the plates of his thigh against the folds of her dress, her body catching his rhythm, more moans left like breathing. His hand left her waist and the restraint lifted, and she moved her hips against his leg. He shifted his arm, and his scent bloomed, and his talons trailed the scent in tracks. Points traced over her skin while his mouth continued on its path. Here was where the conflict and the struggle lived. She wanted him inside. Now, that part of her mind driving her body to strain to reach his mouth, to draw him out of his body until he was driving into her, seeking only that moment. She was straining and raw. He didn't particularly care if she saw herself as flawed and errant, undeserving of his overwhelming devotion. She saw herself as faded and not having earned her keep. He disagreed vehemently enough to create this dissonant image in herself as a person of less than average worth and utility, where he saw a goddess bathed in the light of the moons. Reverie would make that all fade, and perfection would be achieved. Reverie spared her the internal strain of self-recriminations. There, they could both be perfect. He was already perfect. She wasn't. That's how she saw it, anyway. Times like this, he wouldn't let her do anything, and her body and mind imploded from the effort of holding still. He sought thousands of building moments and asked her mind to lie quiet, to accept every stroke and touch as a gift, as worship. She sought equality, and he blew that all to hell. He wouldn't allow balance or equality. He showed her over and over that he never agreed to seeing her the way she saw herself. She remembered him saying, "That thing you do where you refuse to acknowledge you are larger than life. We know life, Morim. We know relative sizes." The switch back to his language and culture had brought out what she'd so often admired in him. His relationship to his own truth. He'd had to live in her world for so long, where everything was negotiable, truth especially. Her force of will no longer colored his reality the way she wanted to see it, and he no longer had to argue with her about it because someone was going to die otherwise. He had time and patience to wear down her sense of self and show her how he saw her. The winds of her mind blew her in one direction. She set her sails and traveled. Then he'd come to her, force the winds to blow his way. He'd make her turn and travel back further than she'd come on her own steam toward him. Figurehead. Did something inside herself demand this from him? Did bonding demand that he had to do this for her? She counted breaths until she could soak in the flawless, rolling sensation that sang in her skin, and her hands flexed on his forearm with less desperation. His hand traced and retraced the light on her skin, his mouth and tongue making cloth over skin, wet, puffs of warm and cool air from his inhales and exhales. Texture from his hands changed from warm strokes and blunt edges of fingertips to sharp, cool trails of talons. Her breathing matched his pace. Her muscles and skin were stripped of any purpose other than waiting for his hands to pass again. His hands teased at edges of fabric, brushing the skin of her breasts without cloth between them. Then his hands moved again to her thighs and waist, and his mouth was on her breasts, her spine arching like a bow. His hand slid between his thigh and her underwear, knuckles against the wet fabric. He added a soft purr to his breathing, pressing mouth plates to her breasts. He sliced fabric and kissed through the rents, his tongue tracing random, jagged paths along the edge of the tears. The air was cool, and her overheated and sensitive skin felt every passage of breeze, every shift of fabric in mouth and hands. He mauled her clothing until it fell away in tatters and shreds, sliding off her body or brushed away in tickles and shivers. He leaned back and looked at her, a fiercely possessive expression in his eyes when they met hers unmeasured moments later, provoking a dizzy flip of her stomach and another spear of vulnerability mixed with lust at the sight of him. He lowered his body onto hers, just a little weight, enough to press plates and sternum blade into her skin, into her breasts, her stomach. He kissed her. Finally he kissed her, nipping at her lips and twining his tongue with hers until the familiar dizzy heat started pounding through her blood. His hand traced the softness on the inside of her thigh, moving to tease and stroke, growling against her mouth. She could kiss him now, so her mouth was ravenous against his, and he absorbed the ferocity of her kiss, answering her frantic hunger with his own slow pace. He slid a finger inside her, his thumb moving with patient slowness, careful when she wanted rending, mindless oblivion. He held her body down with his own, and the trickle of reverie wasn't enough. Her control evaporated. She felt her skin light with patches of blue, cloud, and lightning, trembles, and tension. She dug her fingernails in until she felt the blood and moved to let go, but he pressed her arms down with his until she was pinned down. She bit at him, and he ignored that, doing exactly what he had been doing, his tongue and hands infuriatingly slow. She had a wisp of thinking, that was stupid, before she did it again, struggling against his arm and hand and trying to lift up, with no actual plan, just impatience and frustration, hunger incarnate, the struggles of an addict. She tried to raise her knees, but he twisted his legs until her feet were trapped in the angles of his spurs. She found her voice long enough to say, I'm going to kill you, and the spirits will bless me for it. Curses were lyrical in Turian. He didn't stop doing what he was doing. You can try, Pecan. Worth it. I'm not sure your feet are supposed to go that way. I can tie them instead. Your call. I'm kind of hoping for the tying, though. There are still a few pieces of that dress that'll work. Out of old habit of cursing him when she was frustrated, she translated her wrath into Turian. May your plates wither and fall, Shakarian. She hadn't argued with him in forever. She hadn't called him that, and he hadn't called her Pecan in a long time. He pulled his head back, and then he shook his head with mock sadness. Tying it is. Maybe a gag. But his fingers didn't stop, and he nipped at her throat. She swallowed hard. Please don't make me apologize when I want to kill you. Please don't make me call you Shepard. I am allowed to call you Shakarian. You never took that right away. This was negotiated before your father. She was arching into him as much as she could. I claim protection of Rincan. He tilted his head and considered her. I don't know. You're kind of ruining this whole I have my own ship thing I have going on here. It was very hard to choose between laughing and moaning, but moaning won as he leaned in and kissed the laughter off her lips, rebuilding the tension in her body, bringing her to a wrenching, blinding orgasm. He kissed her with his unchanged, slow pace, his body pressing her down, immobile except for her mouth. He withdrew his hand, tracing a finger up her body, drawing a wet line around a nipple, and then palming her breast and growling against her mouth. He nudged her nose with his affectionately, and then brought his arm away from her hands. He took her hands in his, in turn, licking at the blood there, and drew each of her fingers into his mouth with a soft growl, sucking at her fingertips. Then he brought his forearm to his mouth, licking a long line along his skin as he watched her. He looked at her with overwrought regret. Now I have to start over. He returned to lazily kissing her skin. She stretched her arms to the side, flexed her wrists, and relaxed her muscles. She rested her hands on his shoulders and caught her breath at least partway, though she continued to pant through her nose. Why don't you call me Shepard? She hadn't thought about it much because it seemed obvious to her. The name Shepard was too linked to her reputation, her persona, to Siha and being a hero. Something she tried to shed, but it grew back like a snake's skin. It was hard to think now, but an example flitted through her thoughts. With a slightly evil twist to her mind born of frustration, she said, Yeah, Archangel, give me the big gun. She was trembling from oversensitized everything. His head jerked up, and he loomed over her, his hand covering her mouth as she started to laugh harder, and then licked his palm. Okay, point made. Then he started to laugh, bracing his arms on either side of her waist. She saw his shoulders and chest heaving with laughter, his eyes lit with humor and love and moonlight. After his laughter died away, he looked down at her and said, You make me crazy. She raised a brow. I make you crazy? You drove me to stupid fighting, cursing, and porn voice. He stood up and lifted her legs from his spurs, smoothed his hand down her thighs. Her synthetic leg had sensation the same as her organic leg, and he always treated them as though they were indistinguishable. She was even ticklish under the knee and bottom of the foot of her new leg. It mirrored the sensation of her other leg. Yes, you make me crazy. I like to return the favor. How could you possibly wonder why I would enjoy making you crazy along with me? Because I'm already there. Yeah, that just makes it better. It's your body's fault. The way you smell, the way you feel, the way you taste, the way you sound, the way you look after your body has come a few times. There are hours during the day when all I can do is want and need, and then I can bring that out in you when I get you to myself. I can show you my mouth needs you. My hands need you. Every sense I have strains to pick up the same need in you. I know you want me, Bakan, but to get to that point where every muscle, every breath, every sound you make means I know if I set you loose, you would drive yourself onto my body, express that need with trembling force. There is no way you're taking that from me. Ever. She felt too much at once at his words, abashed and ashamed and exalted and eased. I'm sorry. Humans don't really notice that much of a change, and I don't have the senses to notice it in you. Does that happen to you? Do you change? Shit, even if you do, I can't tell. I'm human. I'm sorry. He shook his head dismissively. I have no idea if I do. I don't think so. No orgasm. I'm a constant. You are not. Your body can do all sorts of things mine can't. I'm just enjoying that fact. All I know is your body can sing. She bit her lip and closed her eyes and said quickly so she wouldn't hedge, I'm sometimes afraid that bonding might force you to, damnation, that this is some level of service or, He started laughing so hard he couldn't hear anything else she might have said. Oh, well, that answered that. Despite the acute embarrassment, she started laughing along with him, if only because the tension in her had to escape somehow. When he didn't stop laughing, she said, Shut up. That only made him laugh harder. Have you noticed that you didn't marry a Turian? Have you noticed you can speak Turian and I can hear you and you could ask questions? She thunked her head back on the console. Damn it. Have I been wrong? Are you in any pain? No, it's not pain. There is a level of torture. He smiled. Yeah, I like that part too. You're a terrible person. He shrugged. Guilty. So are you. She bit her lip. Yeah, well, that's true. But I worry. I'm shocked. I worry that this conversation you have with my body means you and my body know things I don't, or that my body is lying to you, or that I'm lying to myself, or even worse, that I really, really, really want you to spend hours and hours and hours while I do absolutely nothing, soaking in pleasure like a sponge, making you work. No, sorry. Continue. Worry. Serious worry. I hate you. I am going to kill you, and the spirits will bless me. When I can walk. She looked at him, and her heart melted. Hopeless. Helpless. Stop being handsome and charming at me. It's rude. Okay. Let me see if I've got it. You are worried. He wrapped a lock of her hair idly around a finger. Okay, more seriously, you are concerned that due to cross-species considerations, I might be picking up certain chemical or physical signals that don't match your image of yourself? Is that what you're thinking? Okay, too much has happened, and we haven't talked about any of it, really. I'm not a biotic anymore. Reverie doesn't clear my system. Ever. I'm swamped. I'm not strong. You told me that's okay, so that's okay, but I can't. I don't have the physical stamina or the biotics to hold you down, or even the will. I swear I will just dive on top of you. You touch me, and I melt. I melt into trembling, incoherent. His brow quirked. And you're demonstrating that. She hit his shoulder and he grunted obligingly. There's this thing called heat. It's a term of mammalian mating. When an animal goes into heat, a female will just stand there, trembling. Hamsters are pretty brutal about it. If a male goes near a female when she's not in heat, she'll rip him to shreds. But when she's in heat, she just stands there, trembling and shaking and... You hamstered me. I swear, I can't... I'm in heat. All the time. All the time. It doesn't go away. It's supposed to go away at some point. Heat is only periodic in mammals, and now it seems it's forever in me. If my body is swapping secrets with you, this is what you have. I am never not thinking about you. You seem fine, the same as I slowly descend into inarticulate and ineffectual lust. Did your bond bypass a few million years of evolution? And if you have, do you want it or do our bodies want it? And do you have to? I'm so confused. If that is true, that is possibly the coolest thing I have ever heard. She tilted her head back and closed her eyes and gritted her teeth. 5 years begun. 5 years of bond to you. 2 years without you. I spent years of inescapable desire with no relief. As you know, I'm 3 times more bonded than your average Taurian. What you don't know is that other Taurians, bonded to other humans here on Earth, don't do the 3 times as much thing. They seem to be normal. He continued to play with her hair, dipping his head to trail his mouth along her skin. She lifted her head. Why? He shrugged casually, answering her question but fascinated by her, unwilling to stop touching her or hold still. I don't know. I've thought about it. We haven't talked about it much, but I've thought about it. I don't know what the real answer is, but the things that are different between you and I is that I bonded to you without you knowing it. And then you died. We didn't have sex when I bonded. Most, well, I imagine all sane people had sex and then bonded. That's what a good Taurian does, anyway. What I did, it isn't done. Not just to a human, but bonding to a person without their consent. Everyone believes you consented to the bond. For me to have done otherwise, to have bonded to you while you were unconscious, unconsenting, unknowing, is unthinkable. I'm not explaining that to a doctor. For that to get out, impossible. I hadn't thought it at the time. But what if that gave me an impossible advantage? I'm a bad Taurian. It could be decided that I coerced you, that you had no choice. I'm sure that would appeal to the Taurian ego, bonding making me irresistible to you. I had no idea what would happen. I didn't honestly think it would affect you because you were human. I expected it to only affect me. Even if I had known it would affect you, I don't know if I would have changed my mind. I likely would have justified it somehow. I wasn't even sure you were going to survive, and I wanted to have that level of dedication to you before you were gone. If you died, I wanted to honor how I felt. If you lived, I had every intention of carrying out a formal courtship on even footing. I knew you were the woman I wanted, and that I wouldn't want another. Maybe all that time apart without sex. Who knows? My experience of having a reasonably normal and active Taurian sex drive, and then the triple overdrive of my bond, My best guess is that after you were resurrected, I was in hot pursuit, biologically. It seemed my body was convinced I had you, and then I lost you. And I needed to get you back. I may always be that way. There's been too much stress, too much loss, too many separations. And there was a gap between species and time to be leaped. He bent his head and kissed her, his hands on either side of her face. You think you're the same while you experience inarticulate lust, but I have been in inarticulate lust for so long, I know no other way to exist. I developed discipline over years. When I see your pulse leap in your throat because I am near you, I have confirmation that you feel for me. Bonding to you means that you are my law, Bakan. When I have the patience, which is not often because when I see you, I want to do too much, too many things at once. I enjoy sharpening your need until I know it feels to you in that moment the way I feel. Every moment. It isn't work. It's... He thought for a moment as he licked a line along her shoulder to her ear, and then said, therapy. He lifted his head and smiled at her. I can hear Morden's words in my head. Bonded male Turian behavior highly responsive to female needs. Biologically, what if that means staying joined, safe from nightmares, safe physically, close to me? What if it means you really never had a choice? I bonded to you when you were at your most vulnerable. I'd better earn that every day, that choice. What if that is what made me have to restrain myself from running away with you to a cave? What if now that also means my body is striving to get you pregnant? I know, and my body knows, that you want children. Once I knew that, I could feel that working on me as well. Wanting to give you a child, feeling I have failed since I can't do that for you. I can understand not knowing the difference between what your body wants and what your mind wants. Having been on the other side of it, and if this bond is affecting you the same way it affects me, I sympathize. I'm not sorry, but I sympathize. I would have preferred to be not quite so insane on the subject, but it appears we may both have fewer choices than we thought. I'm grateful for the company. Tell me, how do male animals respond to a female in heat? Mostly what I've seen is what I've said. Kind of brutal. Stand there, hold still, bite, shove. He looked at her and smiled. You don't say. Her head fell back. Oh, spirits. I married a hamster. He laughed and stroked her cheekbone. No, you married a Turian. That's pretty standard Turian behavior. I married a human who may or may not have been encouraged to become a hamster through bonding chemistry. You have changed. Your scent, your personality, your job, your emotional state. Your body changed from biotic human to dead human to superhuman to Leviathan-enhanced superhuman to Leviathan-enhanced normal human. You've changed so often it's hard to retrace what happened. The change always starts with you and then moves through me. I can feel it, and I've felt it get stronger and stronger over years. Yes, I enjoyed you being able to overpower me, but it always drove me to more competitively overpower you. I do not miss you kicking my ass. I'm not nostalgic for the injuries. I am happy if you are happy with who you are. I adjust. You also know you can kick my ass by simply asking. You don't ask. You allow me to torture you. You've given your bond to me so fully, you don't consider using your tongue to ask me to stop when you know I would immediately. Instead, you use your tongue and body to beg for more. You have given me proof of your promise that your purpose is me. Now there's less drama, less worry, and I can protect you. Now I don't have to escalate into overt dominance. I don't need to feel that I won't be enough to keep you from choosing to die. I don't need to worry that you will die if I'm not there. Every moment. I feel as intensely for you. More intensely. But it can be focused with intimacy and not conflict. I can't separate out all the danger and fear that drove us to who we were then. I prefer now. You and I have wounds, some that may never heal. And some of mine have to do with the anxiety of not having been enough for you, not having been able to protect you. I will always know that you died, and that the mission where you died was my idea. Having you under my hands, knowing that you need me, I can find no greater peace out of reverie. It is a balm for my conscious mind that it isn't only reverie, that I didn't only offer you chemistry, and that you did have a choice. It's possible that with the change from you leading and being in danger every day, then me leading and you being safe, still, staying at home, what might be interpreted by both of us intellectually and biologically as nesting behavior, it may be that the secrets of your body whisper, and the response of my body has hamstered you, that you are in heat, that our bodies strive to get you pregnant together. Thoughts were swirling. She still had more questions than answers, what she said. I don't know if I want children. He smiled a little sadly, his mandible flaring wide and then pulling in close, expressing disagreement in a Turian as clearly as shaking a head would be for a human. If I were human, you'd want children. Hearing that broke her heart. She quickly shook her head. No, well, yes, but no. For now, I'm terrified of the idea of children. I'm jealous and protective of the time I get to spend with you. I don't have extra time or energy for the idea of a baby. I'm frightened of having you taken from me. That still takes up so much space in my head. I'm frankly terrified at the idea that I might have to function if you were gone, to have a child to care for when I had nothing to give but grief. I'm horrified at the possibility of making a loved innocent a target of violence or abduction, putting you through that. I no longer want to live if you're gone. I'm done with that level of bravery. Nobody needs me other than you. I'm reluctant to reach toward another being needing me yet. You are my purpose. Even if you were human, those things would still be true. I know you'd adopt a Krogan or a human or a Turian or a Vorcha for me. I don't know how you feel about children, and with this conversation, I don't even know if either of us have any say over what our bodies are trying to accomplish. I have an implant preventing conception. It suppresses ovulation and periods. It's active for 5 more years. I promise you, if you were human, I'd be just as frightened, just as jealous, unsure enough to say no. For now. It's a terribly selfish thing to say, especially if you truly want children. You've never spoken of it, but right now, I want 20 years more to spend with you, just you. Turians usually don't have children until then, right? I've done some of my own research. Garrus, I'm asking you now. What do you want? His head tilted as if trying to see if she were telling the truth, and then trying to decide how much of his own truth to tell. I suspect you and I have the same answer at this point. We're busy asking each other, what do you want? And we can't decide until we know what the other wants. And that changes our opinion. We're also notoriously good at not asking ourselves or each other important questions. For example, where are we? In a ship you arranged to have put in my name with a stealth drive no other ship has. Where are we going? To my home world, abandoning yours, without you even speaking of a plan to return. You made these plans quietly, secretly, to give me what you know I wanted. I'm not sorry I bonded to a hamster with this much influence and the power of charismatic speech. You are, by the way, going to have to continue to have at least 2 planets and 1 bondmate wrapped around your tiny, helpless, faintingly weak hamster finger. I am grateful you gave away Boo, so I no longer have competition for your affection. Being married to you is still like being pulled into the gravity well of a singularity. If you ask me which direction do I wish to turn in that well, that's often irrelevant. It all comes down to, which way do you want to turn me? I understand, I truly understand why you did not include me in these plans. If I am right, you wanted to prove to me that you were all in, and you didn't want me to argue with you about abandoning Earth. You are abandoning Earth, aren't you? For me. Yes. If I want a family. And I do. I already have one. You will be embraced by a planet that needs you. You deserve to be needed. I will be with you, and we will work together. I understand that. And I know it is a gift, freely given, and you expect nothing for yourself. And that is the only problem I have with this generous and understanding, perfect solution. She shook her head. I will have you. That's all I want. I want you to be happy. He nuzzled the side of her throat. Then you understand my answer to, do you want children, is, what do you want? My answers have everything to do with what you want. I would ask nothing for myself. I would have you. You would be happy. That is what I want. If you do not want children, I do not want children for the reasons you gave. If you changed your mind in the next 30 seconds, my mind would be changed. Whatever you choose, adoption, research into carrying a child yourself, I would want that for you. I might want children for my own sake at some point, but I share your concerns. I share your jealousy. I do not want to share you. Not yet. But I also don't want to be so selfish that I keep you from what you want. If it brought you joy, it would bring me joy. I don't know if this is going to change, but a child you loved would be a child I loved. I can't make these choices without knowing what you want. You are not good at wanting things for yourself. It makes it hard to get them for you. Other than destroying Reapers, which we have covered, having a child is the only wish you have ever expressed to me that I can't get for you. She took his face between her hands. I could get a child for myself. You know I could. I haven't. I could have adopted. I could still adopt. You should know in your heart that it's not something between us that has stopped me from doing that. Forgive me if it sounds weak, selfish, needy, or biologically inconvenient, but I want you to myself. You wanted me to notice that every life that is still lived, I helped. I feel with that, with the academies, that I have access to, and I'm a part of the lives of so many children. Maybe I was dreaming of having children before because I couldn't have it, but now I can. But now I do. We could. Do I want to devote my energy to that right now? No. We have new jobs, a new home, 2 planets worth of challenges. We have family already to submerge ourselves in, to be a part of. Maybe it's so simple. Maybe I don't want a baby because I'm so selfish that I don't want to be pulled out of your arms at 3 a.m. for a feeding. It may be exactly that. It may be that I'm so incredibly jealous of my time with you that I won't even allow a child with your blue eyes or with my red hair to take me from you, even temporarily. That might change. Part of me is trying to pace myself, too. We've got, 98 years left? I shouldn't blow everything all at once. I'm only 1 year into this peacetime marriage thing. He nodded, and by his expression, she thought he believed her. Her heart unclenched a little. So, when I say that my bondmate does unexpected things to make me happy, things that cost her in ways I can't fathom, I would like to know, how is it that when I want to do things to make you happy, torture that makes your body sing, why is it somehow a burden that I should not bear? Well, when you put it that way. Considering that my bondmate engaged the confidence of not 1, but 2 Primarchs, and made me an offer it was impossible to refuse without offending my current Primarch, my future Primarch, my family, and my bondmate? She smiled weakly. I am aware that my bondmate is manipulative, a liar. He looked at her closely, and she kept her smile steady. Barely. And now I find out she is a hamster. You are stuck with me in biological overdrive. I like it. I don't want to want you any less. I don't want you to want me any less. I want to see you need me, Venri. I want to see and feel and taste and hear your body straining for mine. Your response to that should be good. More. Yes. Please. Yes, perhaps I could have been an artist if you weren't my bondmate. You should not mourn my lack of creativity left in a museum. You are my canvas. We're headed into a life that you find crafted with your tiny little manipulative lying hands with way too many fingers. A life that will encourage you to diplomatically lie and manipulate. If you know me well enough to know that I want that life together, then I know you well enough to know what you want. And we are going to celebrate those things. I do have to mention that it might run in the family, considering my bondmate has had security on me for over a year without asking me whether or not I wanted a detail following me 24 hours a day. Yeah, I figured you knew. There's no way gunfire doesn't get your attention. So many people want to kill or hurt you. It's a constant. It will be easier on Paladin. Okay. So you're lying and manipulative, and I'm more than a little ruthless and domineering. I'm sure we're both shocked to discover it. He looked at her sternly. Thank you for my future, for my family, for this life. I don't know entirely what it cost you, but I know you would tell me it didn't cost you anything, that you had no choice, that you wanted this for me. That's why I didn't ask. I understand why you didn't ask me about this, but someday, Bagan, you will ask me a question. Someday you will consult me before you dictate the terms of our lives together. Someday I'll consult you about the lengths taken for your safety. Someday. It's too late for today. Today we have to shut up and let it go. All right. New life. New rules. I will ask more questions. And I'm not sorry. He caressed her cheek. I'm not sorry, too. He kissed her for a long, long time, until she was thoroughly dizzy and clutching at his shoulders. He sharpened the tight and aching hunger in her body with the same slow pace and patience, his hands and mouth lingering, loving, and thorough. She got lost in the passing and returning hot and cold tongue and scrape and point of his body. He pulled the strength and will from her until she was, as she often was, composed of need and please in his name. He fed her pleasure and frank, unapologetic worship and his own need, his strength, the only strength allowed. Warm, soft, weak, helpless. Her boxes and categories and compartments shattered, and all that remained was her mate's chosen purpose and dedication to her body and whatever secrets her body whispered to his, bypassing her knowledge entirely. She let go, really let go of roles and expectations and modern civilized thoughts of balance and equality, and she lost herself in his hands and his mouth and the words she didn't understand, but she felt. She closed her eyes and stayed that way, His body came to cover hers, to press down on her, to press inside. Her legs and arms wrapping around him and holding him tight to her, every moment precious. She began to experience faith as a thing as solid as her muscle, as rushing like her blood, not like a thought that passed. He lifted and embraced her, whispered more words in his beautiful, warm voice. The moon was long gone, forgotten, as he lay beside her in the cabin of his ship, his hands in her hair and his voice at her ear. She thought briefly that it had been entirely silly to try to imagine a life as dual stars, without realizing the inexorable gravity well that guided their dance. They were both caught, unable to escape, both equally determined that their will was what had allowed the gravity to build in the first place, that they were living a blessing of peace. Their personal small choices had led to the inescapable they'd both wanted. His words left few spaces, but she filled those with words of love, of surrender, of devotion, of dancing, in his language, in her voice.